Good morning from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant, and we welcome you to Kentucky Newsmakers and hope you're enjoying your weekend. Later, a couple of websites to check if you want to be sure you're registered and set for the November statewide elections, and an inspiring story about fishing with friends and sharing some tough and sometimes complicated experiences. A report by our Sam Dick on that a little bit later. But first, the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Kentucky is here. Robert Duncan was appointed by President Trump to uphold the federal laws in the 67 easternmost counties of the Commonwealth. Duncan is making the drug addiction problem a major focus, including interrupting the pipelines that get it here. He's also working to seek justice for the elderly who are often taken advantage of. And in a state with a history of election-related corruption, his team keeps a close eye there and on other areas of public corruption as well. Duncan oversees a staff of about 83 who also prosecute crimes involving terrorism, firearms, child exploitation, and immigration. U.S. Attorney Robert Duncan Jr. joining us today, and we welcome you. Thanks for coming, Rob.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it very much.
I appreciate the opportunity.
So you have broad responsibilities for upholding the federal laws in the Eastern District of Kentucky. How do you prioritize your time and what your emphasis will be during your tenure?
So our priorities are set by the National Department of Justice, and we largely track what DOJ priorities are. I think in our district, the areas of needs align very well with what DOJ has prioritized for enforcement, particularly the opioid crisis. It's something that has affected not just our state, but really all of the Appalachian region. But in the Eastern District of Kentucky, it is a particularly acute problem, one that we are dealing with in a multifaceted approach, both with addressing the illicit supply of drugs like fentanyl and the fentanyl analogs, but also the diversion of lawfully prescribed pharmaceuticals, and going after those bad actors that continue to unnecessarily prescribe and unnecessarily dispense controlled substances, which help fuel the overall problem.
You were already an assistant U.S. attorney when you were appointed to this position. Did anything surprise you in terms of the emphasis that you have had to place on this opioid crisis?
I knew going in, based on my background as an assistant U.S. attorney, the last portion of that time I spent as an AUSA was prosecuting drug cases, particularly complex, multi-jurisdictional cases involving the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force. OCDF is a mechanism that brings together federal, state, and local law enforcement to disrupt and dismantle the most serious drug trafficking and criminal organizations that we have operating in our district and elsewhere. So from that perspective, as an AUSA, I knew the drug problems that we were facing in the district firsthand from my experience in working in and with law enforcement officers to go after these groups.
So we well know that the opioid crisis has hit Kentucky fiercely, certainly, really hard. The deadly overdoses, the addictions, the families are ripped apart, the communities that are trying to deal with it and are in some cases overwhelmed financially with the result of the challenges. Do you think that there is a coordinated strategy in place now that eventually will make this better?
I do. I think that the administration certainly has a major focus on opioid enforcement and opioid prevention. There are many efforts underway to make sure that folks have access to treatment and to encourage folks to seek the treatment that they need. Our office in particular also puts, in addition to our enforcement responsibilities, we put an emphasis on prevention. And most folks wouldn't think that law enforcement would have a role necessarily in prevention. Part of it is through the aggressive enforcement. We prevent drugs from hitting the street. We prevent others from becoming addicted. But prevention also means educating the community and going out into the public. One of the ways that we do that is through the efforts of our Heroin Education Action Team, or USA HEAT. HEAT is comprised of family members who have lost loved ones to overdose deaths. And they go out into the public and they're willing to share their stories about how their loved one came to be addicted and ultimately lost their life because of their addiction. These mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters go out to school groups, community groups, and spread the message of, look, this is dangerous, it's deadly. All it takes is one pill. All it takes is somebody taking a pill from the medicine cabinet or taking it from an unauthorized source that can lead to a path of addiction and ultimately leads to death.
So you are truly trying to interrupt the cycle.
We are at all levels, both the cycle of distribution and then on the prevention end to encourage folks not to start.
You've told me that Kentucky has, or your district has, what, 5 of the top counties for overdoses in the country?
Just in our state, 5 of
yeah.
the top counties for overdose deaths per capita are in the Eastern District of Kentucky, including a couple here in Central Kentucky, Madison County and Clark County. So certainly, opioids remain an acute problem that we are facing, and that we are working with our partners all across law enforcement to address. You know, the overdose death fatality report that the Kentucky Office of Drug Control Policy recently released for the 2018 data was positive. Statewide, there was a 15% reduction in overdose deaths last year. That result is about 230 people. And you see these numbers on the page and you hear people talk about the numbers, and sometimes we get, I think, numb to the statistics, but those statistics represent lives lost. Anything that we can do to lessen the lives lost, we're committed to doing.
When you talk about pipelines and supply into Kentucky, I mean, it is so multifaceted. We know that some years ago there was the attempt to go after the pain clinics that were so much of that was coming in. The fentanyl was a whole new situation and even deadlier that started coming in. But generally, as much as you can tell us, what should people know about how you prioritize trying to shut off the supply here?
So we do that in a few ways. And as I mentioned earlier, combating the trafficking organizations that are bringing in the illicit drugs like fentanyl and the fentanyl analogs and heroin, we make that a high priority of going after the organizations at the highest level that we can here locally, then regionally, and working with our partners across the country and in state and federal law enforcement, ultimately trying to take it back to the source. In every drug investigation, we look to try to take our investigation as high as we can go up the ladder, including to the sources of the drugs. There's several initiatives that are at play, both on the illicit and the prescription side. One of the efforts that we're undertaking on prescription drug abuse is through the Appalachian Prescription Regional Opioid Initiative, or ARPO. It's a partnership with other U.S. Attorney's offices in the region, as well as the Criminal Division out of Maine Justice, and our federal and state law enforcement partners, to use data to try to identify the outliers, the folks in the medical community, that the few bad apples that may be unnecessarily prescribing or unnecessarily dispensing, and then building investigations. You mentioned pill mills. That's something that our office has historically been very aggressive in going after and prosecuting. And the ARPO initiative is really an outgrowth of that, just on a larger regional scale.
Yeah, this is a nationwide problem, obviously, but it sounds like you're saying that Washington gets it, that Appalachia, and particularly your jurisdiction, is a real trouble spot for this.
Absolutely. We have received great support from the department in the terms of resources and funding. We've received additional positions to combat the opioid crisis. Both on the pill side, we've received a prosecutor dedicated to prosecute nothing but opioid-related healthcare fraud. Most folks, I don't think, would make a link between opioids and healthcare fraud, but often the doctors that are unnecessarily prescribing are also engaging in acts of unnecessary billing and committing fraud on the healthcare system. That's one resource we've received. We've also received a prosecutor especially funded to prosecute fentanyl cases here in Fayette County through the Synthetic Opioid Surge Initiative that the department rolled out a little over a year ago. And so those extra resources help augment the resources we've already dedicated to address the problem.
How frustrating is it to law enforcement that once something seems to be addressed head on, and there comes to be some hopeful signs, and we have had a slight reduction, maybe 15% reduction actually in overdoses, which is a good thing, but we know the problem is continuing to be so rough. But then something else springs up. Now we have methamphetamines back as an issue.
It's always a challenge for law enforcement, but we have to be able to adapt, and we have to be able to adjust resources and shift focus if necessary. Not saying at all that we're going to take our eye off the ball on addressing the opioid crisis. We still remain steadfastly committed to doing our part in that arena. But we're also aware of the other emerging threats like methamphetamine. It's a different kind of methamphetamine that is available now that, from when I started as a prosecutor almost 15 years ago. This methamphetamine is much stronger, much more potent, much more deadly, I believe, and it's becoming more readily available at a cheaper price point. The meth that we're seeing now throughout our district is often 90 to 95 plus percent pure, which is extremely potent and can be extremely dangerous, not just for the folks that are using the product, but also for law enforcement. We tend to see an intersection of violence with folks that are involved in the meth trade and the meth use. So it is something that we're aware of, and we're committed to putting resources to address that problem, particularly in southeastern Kentucky, where it seems to be the most acute. Methamphetamine enforcement and associated violent crime enforcement are going to be two of our top priorities going into the next year and beyond. The
violent crime issue is an area that I want to explore just a little bit, and the tie into the drug trade. So often in a very general way we say, well, it's drugs, is what leads to these shootings or these issues that we see throughout our viewing area, certainly. Is that correlation in fact real?
Drugs always are associated with violence, and I do believe they certainly play a part in driving a large amount of violent crime that we see throughout our district. Reducing violent crime, not just here in Lexington, but in the other 66 counties that comprise the Eastern District and that we serve, remains a high priority. The department's centerpiece program for addressing violent crime is the Project Safe Neighborhoods program. PSN has been around for a number of years, but this iteration, this version of PSN is more specific and more focused. PSN is still based on partnerships with state, local, and federal law enforcement and community partners. Different this time around, we are looking to go after the most violent offenders, the worst of the worst, if you will. The ones, individuals in the communities that are driving the most acts of violence, that are the trigger pullers, the ones that are out doing the shootings and committing other criminal activity. And we want to use the PSN model, not just here in Lexington, but all across the district, to identify the folks that are driving the violence, and then to use our resources, whether it's state resources or federal resources, to bring cases to bear against them, ultimately to protect the public.
Often our first responders are very much in a hot zone situation, trying to stop or make an arrest in a situation where there's been something happening. It sounds like by the time it gets to you, you have to step back and make some very methodical decisions about how to go forward.
We do. Part of our job is, as prosecutors and being in law enforcement, is to evaluate the cases and to make sure that those cases are meritorious. But I will say that our law enforcement partners do great work, not just throughout the district, but here in Lexington. We're very fortunate to have such good leadership at the local law enforcement level with Lawrence Weathers, the Chief of Police, Luanna Redcorn, the Commonwealth's Attorney, Kathy Witt, the Fayette County Sheriff. Those are all tremendous partners that we have in our effort to reduce violent crime. And I think the results from last year show that we had some success. We set up a violent crime task force here in Fayette County with those partners that I mentioned, along with federal partners like ATF and DEA and FBI and the U.S. Marshal Service. Those folks all came together recognizing that there was a need, and because of our good relationships and information sharing, we're able to make some impact. Last year in Lexington, according to the data from the police department, violent crime was down 13%, including assaults, murders, shootings, so all very positive news. We recognize that it's an ongoing issue, and it's something that we're going to have to continue to address, but we are all committed to doing that, and we're going to make sure that we're doing our part to help keep the community safe.
U.S. Attorney Rob Duncan is with us on Kentucky Newsmakers. Our remaining moments with him coming up in just a moment, and we'll talk about some of his other responsibilities when we come right back. Welcome back to WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers, and we're visiting today with the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Kentucky, Rob Duncan. Again, we mentioned you were a staff attorney before, assistant U.S. attorney, and were working in that office before, but this has had to be a big change for you.
It is, Bill. I see it from an entirely different perspective now, going from the line to the U.S. attorney position. First of all, it's an honor to have this opportunity. It's something that I never really gave a whole lot of thought to, but the opportunity presented itself, and I was certainly fortunate to be nominated, and it truly is, it's a dream job for me.
Kentucky has an unfortunate history of public corruption and election misdeeds. We know that. As the general election approaches, what can you tell us that your office is attempting to do in this election and in those to come?
So I think public corruption, you're right, has been historically a problem for Eastern Kentucky, and our office has been involved in many efforts to address that problem, going back years and years. Several investigations come to mind. The Bop Trot investigation of the late 80s and early 90s, our office was heavily involved in that and the prosecutions that followed. In more recent times, we've investigated both state and local elected officials of both parties. To me, it's not a partisan issue. It's about right and wrong. It's about following the rules. It's about playing by the rules and making sure that everyone understands that the rules apply equally to everybody. We're going to continue to be involved in that arena, particularly with our work with the FBI. They are our primary partner in pursuing these public corruption cases, and it's something that we remain committed to doing.
Local officials handle a lot of taxpayers' money, and they make decisions about the money, and they're involved in decisions about how the city will be planned in ways that people may or may not want to weigh in on, so there's a lot to watch there, isn't there?
It's public corruption is a broad arena. There are many ways that in many forms it can take. It's again something that we are focused on and will remain so.
Recent conviction of Lexington businessman Jerry Lundergan and an associate for deeds related to the 2014 Senate campaign of Lundergan's daughter, the Secretary of State, Allison Lundergan Grimes. You put out immediately after that a news release that said it sent a message.
I think the message is, like I said a moment ago, that the rules apply to everyone, and it reinforces that fundamental principle that everyone has to play by the same set of rules. And I don't want to speak too much about that case because there are still proceedings ongoing. There's a sentencing that will take place in a few months. But just generally, the importance of public corruption cases is just that. It enforces the rule of law, and it reinforces the principles of the rule of law.
Gun violence is a major problem in Lexington and throughout the country. We've glanced at that in this interview, but obviously how that will be handled from a policy standpoint is up in the air, and it's up to Congress and the President and so forth. But what does your office do now to try to enforce firearms laws as they are? Sure,
we enforce the laws as they are on the books, and like you mentioned, it's not our job to wade into the policy, but we do take very seriously our job to enforce the law. We prosecute firearms cases in a number of manners, probably most commonly a couple ways. Those folks that are prohibited persons in possession of a firearm. So if you're convicted of a felony offense, or you have a qualifying domestic violence order or a misdemeanor conviction of domestic violence, or you're in the country illegally, those are all types of prohibitors. We enforce the law in that manner. It's also illegal to carry a firearm in furtherance of drug trafficking or another violent crime. We have a high number of those prosecutions as well. We also work with the ATF primarily to enforce laws related to folks attempting to unlawfully obtain firearms that are prohibited, including those folks that go to federally licensed firearms dealers and fill out the ATF Form 4473 and lie on the form. We prosecute those cases. So we are very serious about keeping guns out of the hands of people that are prohibited from possessing them.
You have made elder justice a top priority as well. You know, many are vulnerable to scams and schemes. Why do you take a particular interest in that area?
Elder justice is important not only in our office but to the department as a whole. Attorney General Barr has made that one of his top line priorities for us to focus on, because it impacts so many Americans throughout the country and our district. The vulnerable victims, including the elderly, it's our duty to make sure that their voices are heard and their rights are vindicated. And particularly relating to elder justice, there are many scams that are out there that folks need to be aware of. The romance scams.
You had a recent case on that here that just came up in the news. You know.
That is correct. There is an ongoing prosecution, and I don't want to talk too much specifically about that, but just generally with romance scams, that's something that we see a lot of, as well as IRS scams, folks calling elderly victims posing as IRS agents. IRS is never going to call you on the phone and ask you to provide your Social Security number or to provide money. So we see that quite frequently. Lottery scams are another big one, where the caller says you won some fantastic prize and all you have to do is pay the shipping, and that just leads down to a path where more money and more money is being sent and ultimately nothing is gained in return. So I think those are important things for the public to know and to be aware of.
About a minute left. Border security is certainly a national issue, but how often does it become an issue in your jurisdiction, or why should people here pay attention?
Well, it is, and it can be an issue here. Certainly, border security is important for a number of reasons. Not just our national security, it also involves and impacts the drug trade. So, with a secure border, there's less likelihood that drugs are going to continue to get through in a high frequency. Here locally, we're committed to enforcing the law. We will do our part with that, and we work in partnership with all of our federal agencies to make sure that we're upholding the law.
U.S. Attorney Robert Duncan, thank you for coming. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate it. All right, we're just over 6 weeks out now until Kentucky will be holding its statewide elections, and if you're keeping up with the upcoming general election, beginning to wonder where you vote or if your registration is up to date, any questions like that, you can do that 24/7 at govoteky.org. govoteky.org, the website for election information and your voter registration. That's Kentucky Newsmakers. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you bright and early this week on WKYT This Morning. We start at 4:30. We're up when you're up. Make it a great week ahead.